Hello, welcome to another episode of Healthy Minds. I'm Julie, your host. This episode is part of our series called Black Mental Health Matters. We are covering different aspects of racism and their impact on mental wellness. I have a super special guest joining us today. Can you introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Tierney Thurmond. I'm a licensed graduate professional counselor and the founder of Adult2 Counseling and Consulting.
Wonderful. So excited. So today we're going to be talking about the history of racial trauma and kind of the impact into our current times. So really quick, and you all should know this number by now, but just in case, if you need any support, you can call 1-800-273-8255, or you can text to 741-741. So racial trauma is something that is a newer concept to me, and I'm just really excited to hear about how maybe you got into this kind of work.
Absolutely. So I got into understanding racial trauma because I was a college administrator. Well, I'm still a college administrator, and I specialize in diversity, equity, inclusion. So I do a lot of work on college campuses around, assisting them with becoming more equitable, creating inclusive classrooms, so on and so forth. And what I began to realize is that obviously there's this racial inequity that's happening in college classrooms or around our country, not just in classrooms, but in healthcare and in policing and communities, so on and so forth. And I personally just began to really consider what was going on in the lives of people of color and what was creating these environments of despair. And there's obviously this discontentment between white people understanding and then people of color, particularly Black people, showing up in these spaces, consistently being marginalized. And so when I really started to look at some of the data and the research, you had to begin to pay attention to the history of trauma associated with being a person of color in this particular country. So when we think about racial trauma, it's essentially the multi-generational, systemic, oppressive experiences that have happened to Black people. So when we think about slavery, so people brought over in bondage, and centuries of being ridiculed, demeaned, dehumanized, not even looked at as human. There has to be some type of, that's trauma associated with that. Their bodies being, utilized as testing instruments. Of course, the economic labor that was in alignment with how Black people were even brought to this country. And so we're talking more about racialized trauma now because we're talking about like police and interactions and over policing in historically Black communities. But these communities have been consistently degraded. These communities have been consistently underserved. So when we think about the compounding issues that have impacted people because of race, trauma is essentially, if you think about post-traumatic stress or post-traumatic stress disorder, those are essentially encounters when people have experienced a traumatic event, but in Black communities, they're consistently being traumatized. So that's just kind of a little bit of an overview about racialized trauma.
Yeah, and there's like so many things. I'm so excited to talk about this for, the rest of our time today. I just wanted to share, because it reminded me, since we brought up police really quickly, I believe it was AOC, our young fiery senator out there in New York, who said, what does it look like to have like defunding the police? And she said a suburb. So you mentioned that the people of color and Black communities are experiencing like less resources, right? Which is traumatizing in itself. But a lot of people aren't able to maybe think about what it looks like to have defunded police. And I really liked her quote about it. It looks like the suburbs.
Yeah.
Oh, well, okay.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, and even when we think about racialized trauma, and even with you just saying that about the suburbs were created because many cities were becoming heavily populated by Black families. So the suburbs were a response to allowing people to kind of move outside of quote unquote the city, these areas that were becoming greatly minoritized. And it's funny you made the comment about defunding the police. So I think it's really important for people to understand we're not saying that police aren't a necessity. Safety is a necessity, but just the same as we begin to take money away from educational systems when they don't perform, I mean, we work in higher education. The same way we begin to take money away from different organizations when they don't meet their goals or their objectives, we have to begin to critically evaluate how policing in our country has been, has received a tremendous amount of funding, but how do we begin to assess reallocating that money to other areas where communities can begin to care for, police, or provide their own safety?
Right. And just one last little snippet on the police thing, because we're talking about it. I think that a lot of the calls that police are going to could be easily handled by existing services that just need more funding, like the mental health support, animal control, domestic violence centers, stuff like that, so that there's all these different resources. But like you said, the funding is being pulled. I've seen some really startling but eye-opening facts, and we're so privileged to live in Maryland, since there is better access to care than some of the more rural states. Like looking at the disparity between police and nurses and mental health support in grade schools was just like eye-opening. I had no idea. I was very privileged to live in my bubble in Maryland and not realize that other states weren't experiencing the same levels of funding for mental health support and nurses and things.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so let's go back into the history. I know you have a lot of really interesting facts and kind of the history of how this trauma has evolved and continues to evolve over time. So I don't know exactly where you want to start, so I'll let you.
Yeah, thank you so much. So even with talking about mental health, I mean, there's a lot of historical data that discusses many of these psychologists or psychiatrists during this time, during the 1800s, that were utilizing the bodies of enslaved Africans to test their approaches to mental health. So at the very beginning, there were thoughts that enslaved Africans had no mental health. So let's just think about that for a second. They had no mental health, no understanding of their mental well-being, because the idea was for you to suffer or for you to have you had to be human, and you had to be an active citizen engaged in the civics. So that means that you needed to be economically advantaged. That means you needed to be able to have voting power. And at the time, there was this approach that was essentially saying that since slaves didn't have any of this access, then they didn't have to deal with any of the stressors that would cause them to have any mental health issues or many mental illnesses. And so throughout time, you began to see this theory kind of evolve. And there were other theorists and practitioners that came along and said, well, these enslaved Africans, these slaves, they do have mental illness. They're crazy enough to want to escape slavery. So then there were terms that were created to describe this innate interest in them wanting to escape slavery. So then you think, well, anyone that's in harsh, dehumanizing conditions would probably want to escape. So then you have this theory around, they must be insane to want to escape slavery. They are incredibly lethargic because they're inherently weaker than other people. But let's think about that for a second. When your body is being utilized regularly to work in a field, to work under, some of the most demanding conditions in the heat, in the winter, mosquitoes, gnats, so on and so forth, I'm sure you're getting fatigued by that. In addition, as we move through history, you have individuals like Dr. James Marion, who began to utilize Black women as sources of research on obstetrics and gynecology. A lot of our founding principles around obstetrics is grounded in the research that was done on enslaved Africans. So Black women who were pregnant, James Marion would, induce a labor, experiment on a fully undeveloped baby. Then what was going on was the theory was that these Black women their melanin and their race led to them being able to bear pain at a greater rate than any other person. So then there's this assumption that Black people can bear pain greater than anyone else. But so just think about this for a moment. If a mother in a community says to another woman who's in labor or who's having a baby, an experience that she had with being tested on, that person is now probably fearful, right? And then you understand too that your baby could be killed, your baby could be taken away from you, you're not going to receive adequate care. So now there's this idea around, I should not say anything. This must happen to me because I may be killed, or I'm going to tell other women about it, but like stay silent about what's happening because they may kill you, they may kill your family, they may hurt you. So what in turn is happening is that this idea has been perpetuated that Black women just can deal with it because they're crying, but they kind of have to hold on to the guilt of losing their child or being tested on or even being raped or so on and so forth. And so when we think about this history that's been perpetuated, and that then leads to this idea that Black people can carry the burden, so we don't talk about it as much, because history has shown us that when we talk about it or if we're vulnerable, we can also be taken advantage of. I mean, historically, the Tuskegee experiment. I mean, even here locally at Johns Hopkins with Henrietta Lacks and how her body was utilized for science experiments. The eugenics in pretty much keeping Black women and men sterile, like that was happening up into the 70s in some rural areas. I mean, there was a documentary that came out some time ago about a woman in South Carolina. So Black people have historically been greatly exposed to ridicule, torment, and again, this traumatizing experience associated with just their race and their overall well-being.
Yeah, and our medical history is just astonishing to consider how many times, basically, the further away from white male you are in the scheme of things, the more likely you are to be taken advantage of, which, still holds true today, in a lot of aspects. I just want to, you and I know, since we're psychology folks, but I wanted to just really quickly, if you don't mind, go over the Tuskegee experiments for everybody, just real quick, so that they know what we're talking about.
Yeah, so the Tuskegee experiment was done in Tuskegee, Alabama, which was essentially this Black men who were exposed to syphilis, and the idea around them receiving the same treatment. I'm going to be honest, most people think of syphilis as a sexually transmitted disease, but untreated can greatly impact your brain and your cerebral impulses and your access and your ability to function, think clearly, so on and so forth. So when we think about the Tuskegee experiment, it was essentially that these Black men were exposed to syphilis, but not giving the adequate health care to then prevent it from impacting their brain functionality.
And I believe the antibiotic or the treatment came out while the experiment was going, and they didn't offer it to them, which is astonishing, and also kind of but one of the code of ethics that APA, the American Psychological Association, now has, like, you can't withhold life-saving treatment, or not necessarily life-saving, but like treatment for quality of life due to these experiments. And I think they were compensated for their graves or burial costs or something, was it? Whereas other experiments, if you're doing something that risky, not that that really happens anymore too much, but if you're doing something that risky, there's often a lot of compensation and information and stuff where this wasn't offered, and they never provided education around what it was at all. So it was uninformed consent, and a lot of this do no harm kind of aspect that carries on into psychology. And then, if you don't mind, Henrietta Lacks, I feel like it was really popular. That book came out, or maybe the Oprah movie, I can't remember which one went where, but it was really popular a few years ago to talk about it. But just in case our younger folks don't know what you're talking about.
Yeah, so Henrietta Lacks was an African-American woman that actually lived here locally. Her I don't know the full story as how she even got into the testing at Johns Hopkins, but her body was utilized, her cells were utilized as the foundation for testing to develop I don't want to say a cure, but treatments to a multitude of the illnesses that we know today, HIV, AIDS, cancer, but her cells were utilized in that experiment without her knowing.
Yeah, and I think they didn't have compensation either for
Exactly.
Right, and they're called HeLa cells.
Mm-hmm.
Adallac, so HeLa. Really interesting book, and like I said, there's an Oprah like documentary, dramedy. I don't know what to call it, but you can learn more about Henrietta Lacks if you'd like. So let me think. Let's talk about the strong Black woman impact a little bit more. I love that you mentioned, the need to be strong, but also warn others. But then, there's this kind of like split, right? There's a dichotomy. How do I keep other people safe, but I need to keep myself safe as well? And that impact on mental health.
Yeah, I think when we really, particularly as an African American woman, I mean, that's one of my most salient identities. I am Black and I am a woman, and I think there's a culture that's been created in our community. And most of my millennial girlfriends, grandmothers, aunties, and previous generations would talk about this this notion around what it means to just kind of carry the burden and not ask for any help. And historically, women of color, Black women in particular, that's my lens, have historically kind of worn the badge of stress and burden with honor, as if like, look at how strong I am, I'm able to carry all of this. But we have not always been historically shown like where this came from. Like, people, particularly Black women, had to be strong out of a necessity to survival, right? There was a survival need there where you had to show up as sturdy so that you wouldn't be taken advantage of. And that is served some purpose over the course of our lives, but it's also a great way in which we're also killing ourselves, whether that's socially, emotionally, physically, spiritually, so on and so forth. So this notion around superwoman syndrome, like this idea that I wear this S on my chest, I have this cape, and I can carry it all, I can do it all, and I don't need any assistance. But the truth of the matter is we do need assistance. And most of the time in social groups, particularly Black women, we're getting our affirmation, our validation, we're getting our esteem because we're collectively collaborating in the how you doing circle, so to speak. So checking on your girlfriends and encouraging them to kind of let their burdens go. I mean, the weight of women who are not only caring for families and caring for significant others, but even we think about the current climate of COVID and the racial unrest, Black women have been carrying those responsibilities for a very, very long time and nurturing families independently without maybe a male counterpart or just the racism or the practices that take male counterparts out of the lives of Black women. So raising their families, being contributors to their jobs, to their churches, to their circles. But there's kind of this emotional labor that's carried in silence for many women. And so when we think about this notion around getting support, and at least in a mental health capacity, we're seeing more women now step into a request for healing. So they're stepping into a therapeutic relationship, whether that's with a psychologist or a licensed professional counselor, or they're receiving some therapy through a church or some social group. But I'm seeing that more women are more apt to talk about, quote unquote, the weightiness. Like I almost feel like my shoulders collapse with just the weightiness of the responsibilities associated with our race, in addition to all the other things that we carry.
What a profound imagery to have, like the weight, the burden on your shoulders. And I've shared this stat before in the podcast, but I think it's worth mentioning that for mental illness, they estimate that about like 40 to 42% of people will actually seek out treatment. And that disproportionately it is people that are far away from the white female model, actually. So males are less likely to seek treatment, but then people of color are also less likely to seek treatment. Likely because of their experiences in the medical world, or perhaps the strong Black woman kind of culture aspect that's carried on. And, I have to say in my work with young adults, 16, 25-year-olds with severe mental illnesses previously, disproportionately, we had, considering the large population of the US, we had a lot more people in our residential program that were Black than white, which indicates that the system had failed them well before they got to us. So basically what happened is, if you make it to a residential setting, that means that, you know, all these other things failed, right? That they weren't sufficient for this person. And there's a number of reasons why that might happen. Perhaps it wasn't offered to them. Perhaps, you know, bad experiences between the relationships of the medical provider and the client, or whatever. But it was always very interesting to me that we had, you know, like 50 or 60% of our residential population as Black people, versus, you know, and of course we had white folks, and then like very rarely did we ever see any representation of any other ethnicities. And it was just very interesting to me, because I wonder about the, and I don't really know where I'm going with this question, but one, that it was interesting. And then two, that I think that we experienced like a, I just don't know what to say. Hold on one second. I know we lost Chris. It says recording should continue. I'll rejoin as soon as I can. Okay. So let me find my thought again. System failure. Where was I going with this? Under-resourced. I don't know. Where was I going with this?
I don't know, but you were making some really valid points and saying that the system failed. Most individuals in the residency were Black people, and essentially what you were also pointing out was that for them to end up in that residency space, there were a number of other interventions that either were not available to them, they weren't exposed to, or I want to maybe didn't work.
Right. And then the other thing is this is where I was going with my question statement, is that not only are we seeing the systemic failures, the overrepresentation of people of color, specifically Black folks in our residential setting, but then we also have the idea that perhaps there's something inherently more dangerous to people of color that makes them warrant, quote unquote, this residential setting, whereas maybe the same person with the exact same symptoms but happens to be white would be serviced in the community, because they're not, quote unquote, a threat.
Right. The bias that's associated with that work is so great. I think the other piece that's really critical when we talk about mental health and mental health practitioners, particularly serving communities from various backgrounds, is that I don't think we stress it enough, the need to have culturally competent mental health practitioners. I mean, we should have culturally competent practitioners across the board, and we have to do work to decolonize the education that people are receiving in school, in undergrad, and in graduate school, particularly these organizations that are producing these practitioners that go out into these communities. I mean, I think about, just an example is that a young person could graduate from undergrad and go to do a Teach for America or Peace Corps or AmeriCorps, and they're placed in a community that doesn't look anything like them, but they're expected to perform in alignment with the cultural values that are in that community. And what ends up happening is, if your lens is one of whiteness or the majority, you're going to think that this community that you're serving is inherently subservient to you or to your culture. And essentially that is essentially what dominance has done throughout time. Is it is said that these people, those other people, are inherently different, meaning deficient, ill-prepared, not competent, lazy, more sickly, weaker-minded, so on and so forth. All of these values all these values that are in alignment with not being valuable, essentially.
Yeah, the psychology field has this abnormal and normal kind of aspect to doing any sort of clinical diagnoses. And I think it's just incredibly, incredibly important that if you are a white practitioner working with somebody that is not white, or if it's somebody of the other gender or different sexual orientation or whatever is going on, that you always are very aware of where you stand, so that you don't intentionally harm the person by not understanding or valuing their experience or accidentally labeling something as part of their culture as something that's abnormal, or worthy of.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So I have a note that says changing the brain, from racial trauma, and I would love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah. So if we think about, the impact, I'll just give you an example. Say you're in a car accident, and you're in a car accident, and that's your means of transportation regularly. And this car accident causes for you to, like, you break your leg, you may have had a fractured rib, maybe you have a seatbelt burn across your chest and your neck. You go to physical therapy for some time. You may then develop some anxiety around getting in a car. You may then develop some anxiety around being in a space that's crowded, or, even getting in an Uber or a Lyft. And so that some would say, well, that anxiety is going to be normal for a while because you encountered an accident that altered your well-being. So when we think about anxiety and how it may create this, you may have vivid dreams, you may have night sweats, you may have shortness of breath, you may have panic attacks from time to time, you may even experience some depression, some fatigue, some sorrow. Maybe there's moments of grief and not really sure where it's coming from, this bargaining, this lack of acceptance, this fear, this irrational fear. And over time, because not only did you have a car accident, are you dealing with that, you're also dealing with your normal life stressors, whether that's you have to go to work, you have to take care of your family, you have to go to the grocery store, so on and so forth. These traumatic encounters have an ability to impact your brain. When we think about even cortisol levels in our body, we hear cortisol very often when we think about women as they age and your difficulty with losing weight. Well, I had a close girlfriend that just recently said to me, she says, during this pandemic, I've been working out every day. I work out, I do jazz, I ride my bicycle, I do this and this. And I said to her, I said, but we're also in a pandemic and there's a racial uprising. So your stress levels, so while you're exercising, your stress levels are probably still very much elevated, which then in turn increases your cortisol levels, which greatly impact your body's ability to function and process accordingly. So trauma greatly impacts the brain. And I mean, even when we think about brain studies as it pertains to how it begins, they can't even talk, begins to kind of like break down over time. Think about a concussion and how that greatly impacts your ability to function, to think, to analyze. And something that we don't always talk about is the development, the maturation process of men and women. So if you think about a traumatic encounter happening to a young boy at a certain time in his life, and his prefrontal cortex doesn't really fully develop until the age of 26, you're having this traumatic encounter. And let's think about this right now. George Floyd died. That video circulated on the news, on social media for a substantial amount of time. So people witnessed that. That's a traumatic encounter that little people and adult people are taking in, and that's compounding, and it's altering our ability to rationalize. It alters our sensors. So now when Black people are pulled over by the police, there's automatic this arousal that happens that maybe like kick into gear your fight or flight. So you may become defensive, you may become argumentative, you also may retreat, you may be become very nervous. So we think about fight or flight, your ability to respond appropriately. I don't even know, quote unquote, what appropriately means now, but your brain's inability to process something in real time because of the trauma that has happened, the vivid dreams that one may have because of the anxiety and the depression. And people may now, even at this moment in time, may be experiencing these waves of really high highs and really low lows and not really sure where it's coming from. And this may not have been something you experienced before. So now even our coping mechanisms have to be reevaluated because of the trauma and the impact that it's had on our memory and our ability to process.
So really quickly, you mentioned like early childhood kind of trauma. So just really quickly, if you're interested, we have talked about adverse childhood experiences before on the podcast. We will do so again. It's one of my favorite topics to talk about and read about. So cortisol is our stress hormone, and it can wear down the pathways in the brain like you were talking about. But we also know that this is then transferred between generations genetically.
Absolutely.
Yeah, there's a really great 5-minute clip, TEDx talk about how stress changes the brain. I highly recommend you watch it if you'd like to. But they found this in rats, that it went down to grandchildren or great grandchildren, that the mom rat had high levels of cortisol, which then impacted her children and children's children and children, and changed the way that these people are experiencing stress. They're either hypervigilant or they're, I can't think of the right word, hypovigilant.
Hypovigilant, yeah.
But it's really interesting to see how this works. So you experience high levels of stress, and for one person, you're now going to be super hypervigilant. You're going to kick into fight or flight anytime anything stresses you out. And then on the flip side, we have the other people that become like numb. Yeah, or like unable to experience stress at the same levels that other people do. Very
Absolutely. I have a colleague right now who is studying the impact of stress on, she's actually studying in the city of Baltimore. She's studying the impact of chronic low-level stress on babies in utero in Black women in the city of Baltimore. And so I'm really interested to see what that report produces, what that research produces. Because I think what is important for us to also understand is that because of this intergenerational trauma, multi-generational trauma and stress and the alteration that is happening, that alteration that is creating, children are already born predisposed to this high level of stress. And then of course, then they're in even greater, there's this greater exposure because of socialization that happens obviously through the child rearing process. And depending upon what community you live in, whether you have access to adequate healthcare, a schooling system, transportation, so on and so forth, those are just almost compounded levels of stress that can create some traumatic encounters for many communities of color.
Yeah, and for some of our other Black Mental Health Matters episodes, we are going to be talking about environmental racism, and then like the actual, we're going to do a whole episode on basically cortisol on the body. So we can definitely talk about that more, but you can also tune in to some of our later episodes if you want to learn more about that. And Anita, my colleague, is going to be talking about pregnancy and racism, which is just really fascinating to learn about if you haven't learned in school or through word of mouth or personal experience in that way. So I know that Tierney, you were going to maybe talk to us a little bit about your own personal connection, and if you're willing.
Yeah, absolutely. So when we think about, for me in particular, when I think about like even some of the research that I've read, it's interesting sometimes when you read research, you're like, oh, that was what that was that I was experiencing that one time. So for instance, just like multi-generational stress, I grew up in a small town in Northeast Georgia, and my grandmother and my great grandmother were sharecroppers. They grew up as sharecroppers. And I mean, there are things that were rules. There were rules in which you operated by in the community as a Black woman in the presence of white people. So I remember things like going into the grocery store with my grandmother, her saying stuff like, you better not touch anything when we go into this store. And so as a kid, I knew that I wasn't supposed to touch anything. I wasn't supposed to ask for anything. But I remember this one time of like when I was shopping with my great grandmother, and I got the gumball packet, and I like threw a gumball in my mouth really fast, and the cashier saw me. And it was never my intention. My intentions weren't to steal the gum. Those weren't my intentions. I just think it was the cleverness and the curiosity of a child seeing gum, and I wanted to chew it. And the cashier who had been watching me and my great grandmother in the store immediately says to her, "You're going to have to pay for that. She already ate that bubble gum." So my grandmother she was very upset with me, because in her world, you don't give white people a reason to think that you are stealing or consider stealing or are not, or you don't have the money to purchase something. And I remember when we left, she just gave me the most, like, the greatest verbal scolding of, like, you're not supposed to do that. And going into stores where my grandmother knew to, like, put the money on the counter, and then the white cashier would pick the money up off the counter and would give her a change by putting it on the counter, because, you know, your hands weren't supposed to touch. There were some stories that I've learned as I've gotten older that I didn't know as a kid. And one of them was of the Moores Bridge lynching that happened in a community that was adjacent to mine. And so when we think about the history of lynching in America, many people think, well, that was so long ago. Well, the lynching that happened on Morris Ford Bridge outside of my hometown was what led to there being laws implemented about the ending of lynching in America. So this was supposedly the last mass lynching that took place, and it happened in a town adjacent to mine in the 1940s. And it was a distant relative of mine that was a sharecropper that had gone into a physical altercation with the landowner about payment. And we know it's no falsehood that as a sharecropper, you're living on someone else's land, you're tending to the land, you're earning a wage, and you're tending to the crops collaboratively. But most of the times, these sharecroppers were descendants of slaves that had probably been sharecropping on a farm for, you know, decades and decades. So an encounter happened where there was a physical altercation. The Black man was put in jail. His wife and his brother-in-law were able to bail him out. And that night, as they were driving home, they were met by a white mob that ended up not only beating them, but also lynching them. And not only were they lynched, but their bodies were also riddled with bullets. And the wife was pregnant. So this is also a form of racial trauma, because when you do this to a community, you instill fear in them. Right? You become terrified that this could possibly happen to you. And that's essentially what's happening right now in our community, is that Black families are terrified. They're afraid that their sons may have the simplest encounter that can turn into something deadly. They're afraid that their significant others may not be treated the same way. So this same fear is coming up in our lives. I watched my grandmother recently watch CNN as the uprisings were happening in Atlanta. And all I could think about was what it must feel like, not necessarily what she's thinking, but what it must feel like in her body to witness her grandchildren experience something that was somewhat a part of her childhood, you know, nearly 70 years ago. So what that must feel like for her. And at that moment, I didn't ask her, because I didn't, I had my own feelings about the current climate. So I wanted to just be gentle with myself before asking her. But that is, again, the weight. And of course, my grandmother is a woman, a Black woman who's carried the sentiments and the fear and the anger and the frustration, but also the hopefulness and also the joy that she would be able to live a life that would garner some freedom for her children and her grandchildren. But I'm sure there's some frustration surrounding why her lineage is still having to deal with the nonsense that she dealt with years ago.
Yeah, incredibly powerful. Thank you for sharing your experience and your grandmother's experience. I know that there have been quote unquote unsubstantiated lynchings in the last few weeks, reports of them, although they're saying that it's suicide. Some of them are not possible to be suicide, of course, but this is ongoing, right? And so it's I don't know why. I do have thoughts about why it's popping up again right now, largely due to some of our current political leaders and their stances on things, but it's also been boiling, I think, or simmering for a long time, and maybe we just weren't as aware of it in the internet, and the way our TV coverage works. Maybe now we have more access to the understanding, because I think that, and this is just my white experience, and talking to my friends that are also white. I was very privileged to live in a different country for a little while, Canada, but in Toronto, where there was, the white folks they were a minority, which was a really interesting experience for me growing up in a very, like, I don't know that I would call it a suburb, but a rural suburb, where it was like 97% white. And then, you know, whoop, I go the other way. It was very eye-opening. I was really privileged to experience the like global thing. And I think it gave me more understanding of the world. And if you've only grown up in one small, you know, everybody believes one thing, and you're never learning anything new from other people or books or media or anything, it's no wonder that these folks are not seeing anything wrong or don't understand what could be toxic or hurtful or damaging about their beliefs. But I think that a lot of folks, maybe, again, living in their privileged bubble, did not know that things were, quote unquote, this bad, or that things were ongoing. I had a couple of friends that I talked to, and we were just like, has this been going on the whole time? And we had no idea, like, or is it the media covering it better? Or is it people care? Or like, what's going on? And we really didn't have a good answer because we haven't done enough research to figure it out. But it is really upsetting to see protest signs and, you know, folks in black and white photos holding stuff up, or like news articles that are dealing with the same issue we are now, you know, what'd you say, 70 years later or more. Really, really upsetting to see that happen.
Yeah.
So one other thing that I think we wanted to cover today was this idea of like internalizing inferiority, and how that kind of shows up. So, I mean, you've kind of shared it loosely, right? The idea of like the really powerful statement of, you don't give white people a reason to kind of talk to you, basically, or question you. And how that would impact your mental health, basically.
Yeah. So when we think about like the history of like the history of marginalization, so when there's a group of people that have consistently maintained their dominance or power or access to power and privilege, there's usually people that are living on the peripheral that are obviously impacted by those people who kind of dictate or orchestrate how their power is used to like marginalize people. And so when we think, with that being said, internalized inferiority comes because like the dominant narrative has been who you are. So there's also this internalized superiority, right? So historically, whiteness has garnered this idea that it is supreme. You know, there's a right and a wrong way, and wrong sometimes has been synonymous with people who live very differently than the mainstream. And so there's this internalization that comes along with that. And for people of color, there are experiences such as stereotype threat. And that is something that I too I've dealt with as a young woman growing up in my predominantly white community in Georgia. And what it essentially says is that stereotype threat was created by Claude Steele, which is this premise that I am aware of the stereotypes that society has about me as a woman. Therefore, I am going to try my hardest to not live in alignment with the stereotype, so that you, as a white person or as white culture, can't classify me as such. So it's essentially this shape shifting that happens, that is me being mindful of what you may think about me, so I don't behave in alignment with what you may think about me. And so that in its own right can create this mental fatigue, which then creates this anxiety, which is also synonymous with racial battle fatigue, which we're consistently having to be mindful of what people may be thinking, or what they may even fear about my existence, so that I am not seen as a threat. And the reality is I can't always control that, but internally I believe I can. So then there's this physiological and a psychological response to it that becomes incredibly overwhelming. And I want to go back to a moment when we think about the lynching piece, the historical piece with the trauma, is that lynching was not something that was done secretly. It was done very publicly. It was very heinous. It was something that white people wanted Black people to observe so that they could keep them, quote unquote, in their proper place. But just if you consider, you know, watching an animal be killed, and, you know, like dragging a deer across the field, that's a public thing. Like the cognitive dissonance that must accompany that experience for white people to take their little children to a lynching tree to see a body hanging down, like the way you have to create kind of this to make sense of that, you have to be experiencing some type of mental disassociation yourself. And so what has happened historically is that white people had to believe that that Black person was wrong, therefore this is the appropriate punishment for this, that's why that person is hanging from this tree. And then for Black people, you internalize it as, did we do something wrong? I don't think we did, but maybe we did, so let's never do anything wrong. Let's stay safe. Let's stay together, or let's leave this place. Because you begin to then become weary of the assumptions that are made about your existence, because you could be on the receiving end of a heinous experience. So there's this too. There's this internalized inferiority and this internalized superiority.
Wow. So, you know, the reason we're kind of talking about the history, even though we're bringing it into today, is, you know, one, that it's ongoing, right? That we're not experiencing much of a break despite laws and things changing. The underlying feelings and actions and things are still ongoing today. But also it brings context to the culture and mental wellness and mental blocks even, and accepting help and reaching out for help and stuff. It really helps us kind of understand what's going on today. What else do you think would be important for folks to understand about the racial trauma or the history of racial trauma to continue building their understanding?
Yeah. I want to say, and this kind of goes back to what you said a moment ago, when you asked, like, has this always been going on and we're just being told about it right now because there's more media coverage. I think it's important for people to realize that racism is not just individual. It's not how we treat each other exclusively. Racism is systemic, and it's so insidious in nature that it is integrated itself into all aspects of our being. This conversation is one example of that because it's about mental health, but it is penetrated and it's permeated schooling, communities, where people live, where people don't live, access to fresh water, clean water, clothing, so on and so forth. So I want people to be engage in some critical analysis as to where did this come from, and am I perpetuating racism in my experience? Because the answer is yes. We're all perpetuating racism to a certain extent, but how can we interrupt those actions and those behaviors, and do a little bit more research?
Yeah, I, fellow educator, of course, always advocate for research and reading books and watching TED Talks and listening to podcasts and things to diversify your information. And that's just good sense, regardless of racism. Like, you should always, you know, look at things from multiple viewpoints and form your own opinion and engage in critical thinking. But I think the problem is that we're learning, sadly, now that we're showing up. And I wish I could say that I had known more before, but reality is I only know what I've taken the time to know, right? And so while I've experienced living in places where I was the minority, and while I've done a lot of reading and I'm a student of psychology and I know the impact of stress and I've studied social psych and all this, I definitely still have a lot more learning to do, and more actions to take to help disrupt the systems as well, because many of these systems are built inherently racist, right? I mean, that's just the way they are. And so That's why a lot of the answers are going to be, we have to like tear the whole thing down and start over again, which is really scary to think about for a lot of people that have been benefiting from these systems for years, decades, centuries, right? Because you're worried that you're going to experience this really quickly for folks. Jane Elliott, who did the Blue Eye, Brown Eye study, is fantastic. I require all my intro to psych students to watch it. So if you're listening, haha, you have to watch it. I'm just kidding, but I do recommend it. She also recently did this thought experiment or something, and I've seen it shared around a lot. I don't know if you've seen this, where she says, raise your hand if you'd like to be, a white man or whatever. And everybody raise your hand if you'd like to be a black man. No.
Julie, can you say that again? I'm sorry. There was a ping there that cover everything that you just said.
Oh no.
So if you can go back to that.
Sure. So recently there's been this thing on social media that Jane Elliott's thought experiment, whatever she was doing, where she basically was like, stand up if you want to be a white male, and everybody's like, oh yeah, right. Like life's pretty good if you're a white male. And then she asked folks to stand up if they want to be a black male, and like no one stands up because they know that the system is stacked against these people. They know that, it's unjust. And it's just really interesting to watch this cognitive dissonance between people acknowledging that the system is inherently stacked against people of color, against women, against people of the non-heteronormative sexual orientation, et cetera. And they're like, yeah, that's a problem. I don't want to do that. And then they're like, okay, I'm done. Like there's no further step to take because they need to kind of resolve their cognitive dissonance, and they just, I don't know how they're doing it, right? But it's really interesting. I highly recommend checking out Jane Elliott's Blue Eye, Green Eye. I think the PBS documentary is called Class Divided, and that's free. If you look it up, you can find, and it's like 50 minutes. I know that's a long time, but it's worth the investment. It's really, really powerful. Okay, so I think we're just about out of time. So I just first want to say thank you so much for joining. I really appreciate your time and your expertise. And then now I'm going to put you on the spot and ask for a self-care send-off for us to help us cope. What do you like to share?
Well, first and foremost, thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure. It has been a tough past few weeks, so it's good to engage in some meaningful dialogue. I was thinking about how to even practice self-care. And one of the things that came up for me in particular is extending myself the grace to change my mind. So that is obviously with what you just said a moment ago, even about the research, knowing that with more information, with more research, with more intellectual curiosity, you have the capacity and you will change your mind. So be open to your mind changing.
Really impactful. I think we're experiencing a lot of resistance to that here in the US at the moment. And so it is normal and natural to change your mind as you learn new things. So please do so. So thank you all so much for joining, for listening in. Thank you, Tierney, for joining. And we are wishing you good mental health.
All right. Take care.